From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here. Coming up today, K-State's Dan O'Brien with his latest comments on the grain market trends. This week he'll focus on the continuing surge in soybean prices. He'll also talk about what that could mean for corn prices as the 2021 battle for acres begins to shape up. Then K-State's Jeff Whitworth advising you wheat and alfalfa growers to watch for signs of insect activity in those crops as this unusually warm winter weather persists, namely winter grain mites in wheat, alfalfa weevil larvae in alfalfa, and army cutworms in both crops, and what this says about the need for control at some point. And standing by, K-State's Mary Knapp to talk Kansas agricultural weather with us here on Agriculture Today.
Make hand washing a healthy habit everywhere you go. Wash your hands with soap and water for at least 20 seconds, especially after going to the bathroom, before, during, and after preparing food, and before eating. If soap and water aren't available, use a hand sanitizer that has at least 60% alcohol. Life is better with clean hands. A message from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention.
This is Agriculture Today, our Friday edition. Thanks for tuning in. As we'll look at the grain markets right here with Dan O'Brien, Mike's side, grain market economist, K-State Research and Extension. The soybean market, the hottest of hot topics within the trading this past week, Dan, and seemingly riding the developments with the South American crop, at least in part, right?
I think to recognize the times that we're in these markets and what caused them is pretty important. And as you say, soybeans are the hottest of the hot markets, but kind of similar to what we saw back in 2012-13. We've got weather-driven markets in a major way. And you look at the closes yesterday. Again, May 21 corn, 432.5. Pardon me, I said May, I meant March. Lead contract 432. May is 434 and 3/4. January soybean contract 1201 and a quarter close. It's closed over 12. The hard red winter wheat March contract closed at 570. So these are historically high markets, and I know that in between major droughts like 1988, 2012, 1993, we look for, wonder when these times are coming. Well, it's here. And these markets were caused by a combination of too much rain, excessive rains, major problems in China. And so they're buyers coming into these markets, particularly for soybeans, but are affecting the corn market and a little bit on the wheat too. So they're buyers in these markets, and they coming in, gobbling up so much of what's available supply-wise has got other buyers involved. And, of course, in Kansas, we've had meetings recently talking with people both online and in person. A lot of enthusiasm for grain sorghum. Grain sorghum basis bids here recently $1 over corn out in southwest Kansas at major markets. A lot of enthusiasm for that. Even that is driven by Chinese demand. When I've looked at the USDA numbers, 98% plus of the shipments and the forward purchases for grain sorghum are from that one buyer. Mm-hmm. What happened in China in terms of floods, that hurt their production, and that coming into a time frame when La Nina weather patterns are affecting South America negatively. Again, when you look at the last several weeks, it's we had dry conditions in South America, rumored rains, so from strength to weakness, and now we come back to strength again.
Little volatility in there, isn't there?
Yeah, it's a weather system-driven thing, but it's not our weather so much. It's weather in these major growing areas of Brazil and Argentina. When we have markets that aren't showing any carry, we talked about corn at 432.5 for the March contract, and you look out to May and July, up about 2 or 3 cents, really no reward, hardly any reward at all for storage on the future side. And then new crop bid for Dees corn at 415. So we were hoping maybe we'd be at 340 not that long ago. But we're at 415, and people are wondering what to do. And for soybeans, I think you see there anticipation that we're going to plant a lot of soybeans here in the U.S. this year. November beans at 1072, current upfront January at 1201. So there's the anticipation. We're going to at least plant the acres that would have the potential to increase the supplies of beans. And we'll talk about the supply-demand balance sheet for beans here and how that could be affected in just a minute. And then wheat, been affected by dry conditions in the Black Sea region and some other places, Australia on and off, but primarily parts of Europe dry as all get out, and that bleeding over into Eastern Europe, Black Sea region affected. So 570 for March, as we talked about before, May 574, July, new crop July at 576. These are tremendous prices, and they're giving no indication of telling anybody to store any crops. Only thing that could be more dramatic is if something happened and these lead contracts jumped 10, 15 cents above everything that follows. So far, they've kind of jumped to a certain level, and then prices are going sideways to slightly higher. I think a key of a panicky market to watch in coming weeks here, given what could happen in South America if they don't come out of their drought, would be these lead contracts. Again, the March 21 corn, January 21 soybeans, wheat affected indirectly, hard winter wheat contract, 570, suddenly jumping above everything that follows. If that happens, we have an inverted market, not just a high market, but an inverted one. And then it's time to really give some thought, some soul searching about what actions to take to not let these pricing opportunities go.
Staying with the soybean market, you've worked up your probability projections for beans this week. They're in your weekly notes. The question is, where's the top in the market potentially? We are at that $12 level, very close to it in the futures, but there may be room for higher ground if certain things fall into place, you say.
The key issue that came out of the December 10th report last week was for soybeans that analysts were surprised that the soybean export number was not changed to the higher side. So you're already sitting at a record high 2.2 billion bushels projected by the USDA. And they were thinking, gosh, it's probably going to go higher. And when you look at that supply-demand balance sheet, what I think is that they had no place to go get it. 2.2 billion bushels projected for exports. They did raise the crush figure up to 2.195. And really beyond that, then you've got seed and residual for just whatever, like 138 million bushels after that. And when we're talking 2.2 billion for those other two in essence. And we can look at what's been shipped so far and what's out there bought ahead. If you look at shipments so far for soybeans, you've got the week ending December the 10th, about 95 million bushels for that week. And we need a pace of 27 all throughout the market year to get to the USDA's projection. But really, that's kind of a faux number in that Brazilian soybeans are probably going to come in earnest in March. So we're about 6 to 10 weeks out. Let's say we have to have double the rate that we've got right now in this time window. Let's say it jumps to 57 million bushels or 67 or 70. We're still gangbusters demand pull right now in terms of actual shipments of soybeans going out. So 95 million bushels, let's say we needed 55, 60 to meet the USDA's projection. It's still a tremendous run. I think one of the reports that's really going to be a surprise that's coming out in January now will be the quarterly stocks number, because we have the November soybean export numbers. I've looked. Well, we have the September and October numbers, and we can make an estimate for November, and it looks like for that quarter about 1.1 billion bushels of soybeans went out the door, and we're into December now, and we're still going. So the USDA, after all their machinations, they dropped the ending stocks figure. After we produced 4.17 billion bushels, the ending stocks of 175, down to 3.8, really under 4% stocks to use. And that's getting us back near that record low of about 2.95 that happened back in 2012, 13, 14 timeframe. One thing that's noticeable to me, Eric, is that we're in the same region in terms of stocks to use that we were before when we had $12 and $13 prices, and now the USDA is projecting $10.55. So you have to ask yourself, how come with the same stocks to use figure, we're at $10.55 now, and we were at 13 and 14 before.
Mm-hmm.
Well, there are different constraining factors in the market. Brazil's bigger now than it was, et cetera. But man, that's $3 or $4 differential. So that's, to me, it says something about the potential volatility to the upside if dry conditions persist in South America and we really see things start to run. And that happens then sometime here in the next 60, 90 days. You're going to have an impact on the acres planted in the U.S. heading off into spring.
And that leads into the last question here. And soybeans and wheat have been where the action is of late, but the corn trade has been comparatively loping along here. Is it likely that corn will start to pick up that pace and shoot even higher?
Well, corn hasn't been quite the demand focus on the export side through these months that soybeans have been, although there has been some Chinese action in the corn market. I think in the December report, the corn people just punted. They decided to wait until they get more accurate numbers in January for the size of the crop. But the last three marketing years, 18-19, we're at 2.2 billion bushels ending stocks. Stocks use 15%, just under 2 in now for the 2019-20 marketing year, down to 14.4%. And now we're sitting at a USDA projection of 1.7 billion bushels, down 11.5%. But if we get this huge pull of acres into soybeans with tremendous prices, that could happen. Even now, it's probably going to happen. Then you have to ask the question, if we have a slug of acres going into soybeans, then where are they going to come from? Well, some are going to come from corn. And I think the futures are saying what they expect. A lot more drop expected right now in the soybean market than for corn when you look at what could happen in the fall of 2021.
Well, you can say with some certainty that there's a little adrenaline in the markets rounding out this calendar year 2020. So we will see what 2021 brings when we next visit Dan about these markets. Thanks for the input, and happy holidays to you and yours.
Thanks, Eric. Take care.
He is Dan O'Brien, grain market economist with K-State Research and Extension. Be sure to have a look at his weekly notes on the trades, posted now on agmanager.info. And this is Agriculture Today.
A social distancing tip.
Putting distance between yourself and others is critical to slowing the spread of coronavirus. So here are ways to stay in contact without the physical contact part. Call, send a text, set up a video conference, post on social media, dedicate a song on the radio. If you have symptoms of fever, dry cough, and shortness of breath, call your healthcare provider before going to their office. For more info, visit coronavirus.gov.
Let's all do our part, because we're all #AloneTogether. Brought to you by the Ad Council.
Next up on Agriculture Today, we'll talk crop insects. And yes, even though we're now soon to enter winter officially, Jeff Whitworth is by once again. He's a crop entomologist with K-State Research and Extension. What we'd like to do here, Jeff, is talk about insect prospects as we have milder conditions around Kansas and what might be stirring in two crops, winter wheat and alfalfa. And you have some thoughts.
Sure. I always have thoughts, Eric. Thank you for asking. Yes, it is just about winter. The two questions I always get, if it's a really cold winter, they say, what effect will this have on insects? Or if it's, like you said, a relatively mild and looks like it may be mild for a time, what effect will that have on insects? For the most part, as the temperatures warm up, a lot of insects overwinter as adults or larvae. If they do, sometimes as temperatures warm up, and I'm talking about in the 60s at least, or sometimes we think 50s are pretty warm in the winter, but as for an insect, it generally has to get them to the 60s or 70s. That will cause them to be active. As the rays of the sun or whatever it is warm them up, they can become active. The arthropods that we probably get the most calls on in wheat is the wintergreen mite. And the wintergreen mites, again, 2 or 3 weeks ago, as it was in the 50s and the 40s during the day, I did start getting calls about wintergreen mites. And they get on the wheat. They're more noticeable, more visible, if you will, when the conditions are dry. And as you know, we've had fairly dry conditions around the state and continue to have fairly dry conditions. The wintergreen mites are very small. You can see them without magnification, but just barely. And generally the best time to see them is at night. They have a red or orange spot on their back and red or orange legs. But if you go out at night with a flashlight, that's when they're active, up until the temperature gets down to the 20. And from about 28 to about 45 or 50 degrees, the wintergreen mite's really active on a cloudy day or at night. So you can go out and look. What they do is they feed on the individual cells of the wheat plant. So if the wintergreen mites are feeding over a period of time, the wheat will look kind of yellowish or silvery from a distance, and you go out and look, and that's the wintergreen mite. But once the temperatures go back to usual wintertime temperatures, in the 30s during the day and down into the below 20s at night, the wintergreen mites will go down into the soil, so they won't be a problem. They will overwinter that way, and then anytime the temperature's over 45 to 48 degrees in the winter, they can come up and they'll feed a little bit. But during that period of time, the feeding will not cause any damage or any problems with the wheat because the wheat's in dormancy anyway. Right. What can be the problem then is in the spring, if we still don't have good growing conditions, if we still don't have good moisture, the wintergreen mites are still there because they built up in the late fall, early winter, and they've overwintered, and then they come back and crawl up the plants just as that wheat starts breaking dormancy. If we don't have moisture, the feeding of the mites, the individual cells, because they pierce the cell and suck out the juice, that coupled with the dry conditions can set back wheat. And in some years, early spring, I've seen it set back or reduce the wheat considerably. Now, we've put out trials before, treated and untreated, to see if the feeding of the wintergreen mite will actually impact wheat, another month or 2 months later. And it really doesn't, but everybody always gets concerned about it. But I would just hold off treating for them. Remember, insecticides, or in this case miticides, don't work as well below 50 degrees. Plus, once we get some moisture in the spring, that wheat should outgrow that damage and those mites will go away and won't be a problem later on in the spring. It's just early, while the temperatures are warming up into the 50s, that those mites can be a problem. But they were building up in pretty good populations around the state up until we got this last cold spell in the first part of December. So that's something to look out for. Also, last spring we had army cutworms. For a lot of guys that are alfalfa and wheat producers, the infestations were about as high as I've seen them for 20 years. The army cutworms, 2020, in the spring, they devastated many areas in alfalfa and wheat fields. Now, again, we didn't have a lot of rain early on in the spring of 2020. It started raining later, but that will impact also the feeding of army cutworms. So I've heard that they're back this year. Whether we're going to have a problem with them like we did in 2020, I don't know. But if you have flocks of birds out in the field, in alfalfa or wheat field, you might go out and check. And right now the larvae are probably about 1/4 of an inch long. I did dig up some, and they were pretty small. They're in the soil. Their feeding won't impact right now just because they're too small. On wheat or alfalfa, if you see what we call a little window painting on the leaf, that's because the larvae is so small he can't eat the whole leaf. He just eats the top side or the bottom side, and it leaves what we call a window pane. Look, if you see a little bit of that, you might dig around and see if you can see the larvae. Again, especially if we don't get good growing conditions, good moisture, they can impact alfalfa or wheat, and they can actually pretty well devastate areas in fields at least, and over pretty good-sized areas, at least they have in years past. I just don't know what to expect. You just have to wait. If we get good moisture in the spring, it should, help all these plants outgrow any damage to wintergreen mites or army cutworms.
Let this serve as a heads up then, with the damage minimal, if at all, this time of the year with that wheat still in dormancy, but be on the alert for possible action to take against the wintergreen mite or the army cutworm. Later on, as we approach springtime, and in alfalfa, there are indications of weevils out there as well?
Yes, again, back in 2018 and 2020, this year, we found alfalfa weevil larvae clear up into November. Now, I don't know if they will overwinter successfully as larvae, because the alfalfa weevil overwinters as an egg and an adult, but Who knows? Maybe they're changing enough that they will, or maybe our conditions will be mild enough the rest of the winter that they will successfully overwinter as larvae. But be that as it may, right in the terminals of the alfalfa, you'll see little tiny brown or black larvae. That means it was killed by cold temperatures. So as that cold weather passes and it warms back up, more eggs hatch. The larvae in the leaf litter down at the base of the plant, they'll become active. They'll start crawling back up the plant. The bottom line is you got to get out and sample. After a cold spell, wait 2 or 3 days, get out and sample for larvae. And if you have enough larvae to justify it, and that's about a 50% infestation, then go ahead and spray. But if the forecast is calling for temperatures to get down below into the 20s again, I really recommend not treating. See if the temperature is going to help you out, as it did in 2020. A lot of fields escaped alfalfa weevil infestations.
Should we be so lucky again? We'll see. But
yeah, I wouldn't count on it.
And we've a bonus topic we wanted to share as well, and this is stepping away from the field and more into the indoor setting, because you're getting repeated questions about this, you say, Jeff. Attic flies in dwellings?
Well, yes. And when we call them attic flies, that's a generic name for any fly that gets inside and causes a problem, not just a house, but a barn or staples or, sheds or whatever. Any house they find attractive for overwintering sites. It can be house flies, stable flies, horn flies, blow flies, any adult fly. And that's how they overwinter as an adult in some sort of a niche that they found that they think they are going to be able to survive the winter. And once that site is located, it's attractive to lots of them, and they'll all congregate, hundreds and thousands of flies. And they find little small sites to get in under the shingles or in under the insulation or in through the roof or whatever. And they're pretty much staying there until the weather warms up. And then when you get a warm spell in the winter like we had a couple of weeks ago, they become active and they start flying around. Of course, the buzzing, and then they'll get downstairs, and their buzzing can drive people nuts, and they die. Only about 2% survive, so that means if you have 10,000 overwintering in your home, that leaves a lot of dead insects up there. So by spring, lots of times there'll be an odor coming from that site because there are other insects get in there and start feeding on them, and fungi. And so lots of times people need to get in there and vacuum up, find out where this odor is coming from, and at the same time figure out how you can caulk up or plug the holes where they're getting in so that it doesn't happen in the fall. Because if your structure is appealing to them in the fall this year, it's going to be appealing to next generation every year. Somehow seal up those cracks and crevices.
That's really the only alternative. There are no other remedies otherwise.
Really, that's it. It's hard to spray, and the sprays don't last long. You're not going to get the spray wherever they are, behind insulation or up in the attic. So the best thing to do is block the entrances however you can and hope for the best.
Yeah. Well, Jeff, happy holidays. Thanks for coming over. And as these insect problems start to really turn to the more active, when the weather does warm up for good, we'll have you back. Appreciate your time.
Well, thank you, and happy holidays to everybody out there. Thank you.
Crop entomologist Jeff Whitworth, K-State Research and Extension, with us on this part of Agriculture Today.
With the shortage of primary care physicians, especially in rural areas, health education and disease prevention are vital. K-State Research and Extension programs address quality of life, personal development, and health behaviors across all life stages of all social-economic groups. To learn more about health education, one of K-State Research and Extension's 5 grand challenges, visit www.ksre.ksu.edu.
You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, coming to you from the campus of Kansas State University. Eric Atkinson here, and today's agricultural news headlines coming your way now, courtesy in part of DTN. The incoming Biden administration should hold to the Phase 1 agreement between the U.S. and China and continue to use tariffs as leverage on China. That's according to U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer in an interview with Reuters. China, he says, has done a reasonably good job in implementing some parts of the pact and not so much in others. China's purchase commitments are one area, he noted, indicating that China is well behind on those commitments, which in part, he says, is due to the pandemic. He said he'd use the dispute settlement process to resolve specific issues, and Lighthizer said he'd keep the tariffs in place for certain. On other trade matters, Lighthizer said the U.S. contention that the WTO has failed relative to reining in China, and that has spawned global agreement that the World Trade Body needs reform. Signals so far from the incoming administration are that they do not plan on changing the current U.S. trade stance on China, and Biden has ordered a review of the Phase 1 trade deal. Lighthizer offered no comment on his potential successor, House Ways and Means Counsel Catherine Tai. The Biden trade agenda revealed thus far indicates their initial actions are not going to veer greatly from the Trump administration, but expectations are that there will be changes ahead. In rural counties where a high percentage of employment originates from meatpacking operations, what trends in COVID rates were recorded? Here's a look at that from the USDA's Rod Bain.
The COVID-19 pandemic's impact on the meatpacking industry was noted with concerns about retail supplies in late spring. Also peaking in late April, according to the 2020 edition of USDA's Rural America at a Glance report, cases of COVID-19 in rural counties where a high proportion of jobs originate from meatpacking operations.
These are counties that have at least 20% of their employees working in meatpacking. We could see a very strong relationship in these counties to COVID-19 cases.
Economic researcher Elizabeth Dobas says at that peak, cases of COVID-19 in meatpacking-dependent counties reached 50 per population of 100,000 people.
A peak that was around 10 times the rate of cases in other counties.
Rates declined significantly starting in mid-May, with partial plant closures and increased social distancing procedures in place.
Since then, these counties have been moving on par with other non-metro counties.
I'm Rod Bain reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
And soybean growers whose fields were injured by off-target dicamba movement in the past 6 years could file claims for compensation as early as late December after the details of a $300 million settlement with Monsanto, now Bayer, was finalized Wednesday. The settlement was originally announced in June, but the agreement was not signed until Wednesday. The settlement will make $300 million from Bayer available to any soybean farmers who can document yield loss from dicamba injury between 2015 and 2020. BASF, by the way, not part of that signed agreement. Under the newly finalized agreement, farmers will have 150 days to file claims after the portal opens. They will need evidence of dicamba symptoms impacting soybeans and will need to produce yield records from which loss calculations can be made. Now, legally acceptable documentation of dicamba symptomology, as they're calling it, could include such things as photographs, state regulatory agency reports, or expert agronomist opinions or notes. Yield loss evidence can be gleaned from field yield histories, crop insurance reports, or readings from a calibrated yield monitor. Well, the 2021 National Festival of Breads, co-sponsored and organized by Kansas Wheat, is now a go. Here's more on that from Marcia Boswell on this week's Kansas Wheat Scoop. Marcia?
The holidays are the perfect time to turn pandemic baking projects into entries for the 2021 National Festival of Breads. The event is going virtual for 2021, further expanding the opportunities to compete in the premier yeast bread baking contest for youth and adults. Winners will receive cash prizes and baking bundles from the event's sponsors, Kansas Wheat, King Arthur Baking Company, and Red Star Yeast. According to Cindy Falk, co-chairperson of the event and nutrition educator for the Kansas Wheat Commission, the National Festival of Breads is the only baking competition of its kind, recognizing the best of the best baking skills and creativity. This year's virtual contest builds upon the rich tradition of grassroots support that has made the festival an experience like none other. The official rules and regulations for the contest are now posted at nationalfestivalofbreads.com. Entries for the National Festival of Breads must be an original yeast bread recipe, must use a Red Star yeast product as a leavening agent, and 75% or more of the total flour in the recipe must be King Arthur wheat flour. A variety of both branded products are eligible for use in the competition. The contest is split into two divisions, adult and youth, with categories for each. The adult categories include savory rolls, sweetbreads and rolls, and traditional breads. Youth categories include sweet rolls and creative bread shape. Entries open on January 8, 2021 and end on February 22nd. Each entry must adhere to specific requirements outlined on the contest website. Winners will be notified in early May, with online voting for the contest's People's Choice Award beginning on May 14th. Prizes for the contest include $2,000 plus a baking bundle for the 3 category winners in the adult categories. One overall Best of Breads champion will be selected from the 3 category winners. The champion will receive a year's supply of Red Star yeast, a year's supply of King Arthur flour, and a $500 King Arthur Baking Company gift card that may be used toward a baking class. Youth winners in the 2 categories will receive $500 plus a baking bundle. In addition, the People's Choice winners will be selected from the 3 adult category winners and the 2 youth category winners. 1 adult and 1 youth will receive a bakeware prize estimated at $100. In addition to these category winner prizes, 1 entrant will win the grand giveaway of a KitchenAid artisan mixer, and 10 additional entrants will receive various bakeware prizes. Read the full set of rules to perfect your entry and learn more about the National Festival of Breads at nationalfestivalofbreads.com. For Kansas Wheat, I'm Marcia Boswell.
Thanks, Marcia. This reminder, if you'd care to hear a replay of any Agriculture Today broadcast, you can find it at agtoday.net. And while you're there, look into the automatic podcast download service as well, agtoday.net. We'll be back in a moment here on the K-State Radio Network.
When you are in need of timely, reliable, and trusted information, K-State Research and Extension is here. Whether it's organizing people, information, or resources, they have the necessary tools. Community comes first for K-State Research and Extension. For more information and to connect with your county's extension agents, visit www.ksre.k-state.edu.
Concluding this Agriculture Today, Kansas agricultural weather in the spotlight with Mary Knapp, climatologist, K-State Research and Extension, stopping by for her weekly visit. This past week, more snow in some locations which had already benefited from that the previous week, Mary, and some places that got much-needed moisture as well.
Right. The winners on the moisture sweepstakes this week were western Kansas, in particular southwestern Kansas, where they had the highest snow totals. There were places in Meade County that reported as much as 14 inches of snow. The division as a whole was more than twice its normal precipitation. The average was right around 54/100ths of an inch for the division. And considering how little they typically get in a week's time in December, that's a significant amount. West Central didn't fare quite as well because the systems came in 2 waves, the first one last weekend and the second one the beginning of this week. The second one hit the northwest area, and they had been missing out on most of the storms up to this point, so it was very welcome for them. Not quite as prolific in the moisture production as the southern system. They averaged about 1.5 to almost 2 times their normal for the week. Move further east, and the amounts drop off significantly. In fact, our driest division was the north central, where they averaged only 0.03 of an inch for the week. And, of course, with the winds and warm temperatures, that's just not going to go very far.
In fact, to that point, the evapotranspiration has been pretty aggressive for this time of the year. So how does the drought monitor read this week? Did we see much shifting there?
We did see some shifting. Not surprisingly, the Southwest, with its second wet week of December, saw some improvement. That by no means erased the drought in that area, and we still have some extreme drought along the Colorado border, but we ate away a little bit at the eastern edge of that drought with a category improvement in parts of the area. Some areas that were in abnormally dry moved to drought-free, but again, it dropped off fairly quickly because we have a well-entrenched deficit as you get closer to that Colorado border.
And you said it, our temperatures have leaned toward the warm side for this stage of the year. That pattern continues, Mary.
Right, and even the last couple of days where we have enjoyed cooler weather, if you would call it that, more seasonal temperatures, we're still running above normal for December, and the departures from normal were in the 2 to 3, as much as 6 degrees warmer than normal. Not surprisingly, the warmest area was up in north central Kansas, again, where they had the drier air and the chance for things to warm up a little bit better than areas further west where they still had snow on the ground.
Well, some parts of Kansas and the winter wheat crop there welcomed this moisture, but as we look to the Christmas week forecast, that's about it for a while.
Right. If we look at the quantitative precip forecast that was released yesterday, which carries us through actually Christmas Day a little bit further than that, nothing. There are some fringes of precipitation that may form on the edges of the state, but we're talking less than 1/10 of an inch in general, which isn't, again, very dramatic. It looks like it's going to be a very open week for the week between now and Christmas. If we look out a little bit further, they've released the January outlook, and that is kind of a mixed bag. Unlike our November and December outlooks, there is an equal chance of wetter or drier than normal over most of the state. The exception is in that southwest corner where they are calling for a slight tilt towards drier than normal. Again, it's hard to get excited about that outlook for January because we get so little of our normal precipitation in January, so it wouldn't take but a single storm to tilt it one way or the other. On the temperature side, it's a lot clearer pattern that the warmer than normal temperatures are expected to continue through January. If we stretch it out and look at the January, February, March outlook, which was also released yesterday, that calls for a continuation of the same pattern, warmer and drier than normal.
If there is good news, you say it's in the adjusted La Nina forecast. All are anxious to exit that weather pattern, and that might occur, they're hoping, earlier than originally thought.
Right. They are expecting it to continue through our winter season, which again includes January and February yet, but there is a decreasing chance, if you will, that it will continue into the spring. So it started out with a fairly strong, about a 90% chance that it would continue into the April-May timeframe, and now they're dropping those percentages down, particularly in the later spring, the May timeframe. Again, as you note, sooner it transitions, the better, because it is a very strong indicator for drier conditions for us. Unfortunately, the skill of the models in that spring season is not particularly great, so it's hard to tell whether that will actually validate, whether it will really end by then, or whether we'll have a more extended presence of that cycle.
Nothing is absolute, but at least hopeful here.
Right. At least there's a sign that might be changing, and we might move into a more favorable pattern as we go into the spring.
Well, we won't visit with you again until the new year is upon us, so happy holidays to you and yours, Mary. Many thanks.
And same to you and all your listeners.
Climatologist Mary Knapp of K-State Research and Extension with us. And before we part, this program note, because of the holidays upcoming, as well as the university's furlough requirements, we'll be away for the next 2 weeks. So we're looking forward to being back with you on Monday, January the 4th. Until then, and as always, thanks for tuning in, and a very Merry Christmas and Happy New Year to you and yours. Eric Atkinson here. This has been Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.